The House of Lords is debating proposed cuts to tax credits, with key votes on whether to block, delay or kill off the government's plan expected, well, in the next hour. Not quite certain of the timing, to be honest, but stay watching. The government says any such attempt would be unconstitutional. Well, with me now is Deven Ghelani, who's director of the Policy in Practice think tank, often said to be right-leaning. But how would you well, for example, what's your attitude to the whole business of welfare?
I'd say we're independent. We look at the analysis on a household-by-household basis. That's what we've been doing for local authorities up and down the country. So based on looking at the cumulative impact of all of these reforms that the government are putting in, both the positive ones on higher wages and higher tax allowance, and the negative ones, we find that those that are the lowest earners in work on working tax credits stand to lose out massively from these reforms, and the mitigation doesn't really stand up to scrutiny.
We've heard so much in the last few hours of, drama in the House of Lords for one thing, which is, to put it mildly, unusual. But also the toing and froing. You've mentioned some of it, but it is a complex matter, isn't it? Overall, government needs to save money in one direction or another, and that you support that broadly.
Well, you can save money, but you don't save. You also need to grow the economy, and I don't think you grow the economy by hitting work incentives. So, for example, those that are about to be hit by these tax credit changes, if they respond by increasing their hours, they're actually being penalised more. That's what these tax credit reforms are doing, and one of the reasons why I think the government's own backbenchers are standing so firm against them and bringing up some quite serious and very valid issues about the government needing to look at this again.
But, of course, people in the Treasury would have run a microscope over this, as with all these changes. Chancellor obviously very determined and has got to push through changes of some sort. How do you think they got themselves into this bind in the first place? I
mean, I think the Chancellor's made a judgment call that says, actually, we're softening the impact by increasing the minimum wage, and that will gloss over the impacts on all of these households that are going to be hardest hit. Now, actually, there are organisations like ours, organisations like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that do gloss over these things with a microscope as well. Again, we've looked at 100,000 individual households. We find that those in receipt of tax credits within that group stand to be significantly worse off, and it's that group that, perhaps you could argue won the election for the Conservatives the last time round, that are about to be the hardest hit again. And I think it doesn't make sense at all for the government to be pushing ahead with this.
But it's politics too, isn't it? Chancellor seeing the Conservatives have a majority in the Commons, which brings us, of course, what's happening in the Lords, but come back to that in a moment. But the Chancellor feeling that the Conservatives are in charge fully now, and if they want to push things through, maybe unpopular for the moment, but in the long term, they think it's worth it.
Well, the Conservatives are in charge. I think the Chancellor, if he thinks he's in charge, he hasn't really given his backbenchers, he hasn't given his own side really enough time to look at alternative proposals. We had the maiden speech, for example, by Heidi Allen. We've got MPs like Steve McFadden, really the government's own backbenchers criticising these changes and really wanting to look at them again. The government was elected, you have to remember, to make work pay. And I think their own backbenchers can see that this clearly acts against that principle, and they've got no way of justifying that going into the next election.
Right, we'll still wait for the votes, but it is said that it's a sort of unconstitutional. The government would argue for the Lords to try to turn back financial, what has been decided on in the Commons on financial grounds. If the Lords start doing this sort of thing, it can make life very difficult for the Conservatives. Are you surprised that the Lords seems to be so determined to do this?
Well, I think if the Lords can't turn this back and give the government time to think again, you really have to ask the question what the Lords are there for in the first place. It's exactly this kind of measure that the Lords exist for, to give the government more time to look at these measures. If the government come back, if their backbenchers agree with the government and they can persuade them, having looked at sensible alternatives, and it goes back to the Lords, then maybe there's a point. But there's a clear need on this occasion for the government to look at this again in much more detail, and we'd be happy to help them to do that.
Deven Ghelani, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.